Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Eden, Director of Programming at Mana Contemporary, and we're excited to have you all here today for the Current Effects panel hosted by Mana Contemporary and presented in partnership with the Earth Institute at Columbia University and the Columbia Climate School. Works by Catherine Chalmers and James Prosak will be included in our upcoming exhibition, Implied Scale, which opens next week. The exhibition not only aims to convey the magnitude of the Earth's climate crisis, but it also aims to inspire action. The exhibition is on view April 22nd through July 22nd. For this panel, Current Effects, Sandra Bell, Associate Professor of Professional Practice and the Director of Campus Sustainability and Climate Action at Barnard College, will moderate the conversation with artists Catherine Chalmers and James Prosak, and Ruth Dufrese, who's the Professor of Ecology and Sustainable Development at Columbia University. Ruth, Catherine, James, Sandra, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Well, we can't see you, but I'm glad that you're out there and so grateful that you've joined us. I'm very excited to talk with these three thinkers, artists, creative people, and learn a little bit more about their work. So as Eden said, my name is Sandra Goldmark. I teach design at Barnard College, and I'm the Director of Sustainability there. So I am a person who has spent the first part of her career working in the arts, and then moved into really retraining my eye and my lens that I applied to the world to thinking about climate change. So it's an honor to be here with people who have done, had related journeys, and I'm excited to learn more about those journeys. So first, we'll just briefly have these, our guests introduce themselves, name and what you do, and then we'll go back around and get a chance to see and hear a little bit more about their work. Then we'll have some discussion, conversation, and some questions, hopefully, from the audience. So just going in the order they appear on my screen, do you want to just introduce yourself, Catherine?
Hi, I'm Catherine Chalmers, artist based in New York, although most of my work, I interact with the environment in more sort of rural places, forests particularly.
James?
My name is James Prosak. I live in Easton, Connecticut, and I work in Easton, Connecticut, the town where I grew up. This is my studio here, and second floor of my studio. I make my living as an artist and a writer, I guess, but labels are always difficult to that's a lot of my work is about the impossibility of describing the complexity of things through words. But I'll leave it at that, artist and writer, and I see the two disciplines or practices as being part of the same thing, especially when I write in my journal, because you can draw sort of an evolutionary lineage from written language back to the first drawings on cave walls. So I see my drawing and writing as part of the same thing. But I just like to make inquiries, and most of them are related to the natural world and my love of various creatures.
Thank you. Ruth?
Yeah, hello everyone. Thank you, Sandra. I'm Ruth Dufrese. I'm on the faculty at Columbia University, and I am in the field of ecology and sustainability science, although I will absolutely second James's quandaries about labels. And I study tropical forests and how people use the landscape and the connection between people and the natural world.
Nice. So, all right, now that we know who we're looking at and who's who, even though with the beauty of Zoom, we already knew because of the name tags, but now we know what's a little bit behind the name, the first kind of label. And maybe let's go in the same order. Catherine, did you be able to share a little bit about your work?
Okay, so I'm going to show some images. I guess I should do share screen first. It says host disabled participant screen sharing. So I can't share my screen. Eden?
Sorry, try again.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
All right, here we go.
We've been doing these Zoom conversations for over a year now, and still.
Okay, so you see leafcutter ants and adocephalotes, see that? Okay. I guess first of all, well, thank you for having me to the panel. I should say a little bit about my process as an artist. I work in the natural world, and a direct engagement with the subjects that I'm working with is central to my practice. And I always work with the animal's natural behavior. I consider them my collaborators. I watch, observe, experiment, and react. And then through this back and forth process between what I'm working with and sort of the ideas that I bring to it, the projects take shape. It's never sort of a top-down thing, because it's a dialogue with a creature that I can't communicate with. And so it's a little bit of a guerrilla filmmaking in the sense is that I go down with a set of ideas, but ultimately in working with the animal that I'm working with, it completely changes. So for the past 10 years, every winter I've been going to the Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica to work with leafcutter ants. E.O. Wilson, the eminent biologist and ant king, calls them the most complex social creatures other than humans. They live in large underground metropolises with up to 8 million members. I'll tell you a little bit about them because many people don't know about them. So, and then I'll get to the art. They live with up to 8 million members where temperature and humidity are precisely controlled. It's a labyrinth of tunnels and chambers that could occupy 10 square meters and be 4 meters deep. And those tunnels are what they run through, and then those big pods are where they raise their larvae and their crop, their farmers. They cut vegetation from high in the forest canopy and carry the pieces in their mandibles across the forest floor, traveling on pathways which they clean up to 100 meters to go and cut their material and come back. And then from this plant material that they cut, they raise a fungus, which is their main food source. My interest in the project has to do with the fact that they are a sophisticated social creature, and at the heart of it is a really interesting sort of network communication. The ants constantly converse with one another using pheromones, sound, and touch. In many ways, they're nature's ultimate mobile communication devices. They live without central command. Millions of ants coordinate their behaviors to create and sustain massive societies. With leafcutter ants, it's always multiple decisions made by multiple minds, and therein lies their power. At MANA, I'll be showing two portions of the leafcutter project. The video We Rule, this is a still from that video, and the related photographic scroll, Colonize the Earth. This section of the project focuses on language and the ants' sophisticated communication network, which rivals the internet and predates it by millions of years. This is the scroll, Colonize the Earth. It's 20 feet long. It's composed of 30 overlapping photographs of the ants descending a tree at night, carrying pieces of leaves and also letters in their mandibles. The title, Colonize the Earth, is in keeping with the ants' ecological power. As the principal herbivore of the forest, leafcutter ants are a dominant species. And like us, they influence the grand structure of all other biological systems in their habitat. And also like us, they wage brutal wars. Here's Colonize the Earth installed at the Sun Valley Museum of Art, and it's unrolled 11 of its 20 feet. The language of power and dominance, such as in the titles We Rule and Colonize the Earth, has been used throughout history to impress superiority across tribes, peoples, cultures, nations. The Leafcutter Ant Project borrows that language and uses it as a metaphor for our relationship to the natural world today. I'll be showing the portraits of war. As often happens when one group declares superiority over another, it leads to violence. The declaration of We Rule often is a prelude to war, and is certainly applicable to our position that we have taken as being dominant in nature and has led to the destruction of the natural, of the ecosystem. Ant wars are hard to find in the forest. The battles spread out from the defined foraging pathways, and they're obscured by the leaf litter. So in order to film and photograph these mini gladiators, I placed small white sheets around the area they were fighting. During the day, the ants went about their business, cutting leaves and quickly habituating to the new surfaces. But every night, the bellicose colony, when the sun went down, came out and attacked its neighbor. Leafcutter ants are one of the few species to wage organized warfare against their own kind. And they even have different strategies depending upon the location and severity of the war. If the battle is close to home, the large soldiers will come out. You can see the large soldier line down there on the right to defend the colony. And if the war is far away, then the small and mid-sized workers are the main combatants. So though many ants were slaughtered in the war that I filmed and photographed, the two colonies did not fight to the death. 3 weeks into the war, the aggressor called it quits, even though I wasn't finished filming. I observed a striking variation amongst ant colonies in their response to another colony harvesting in the vicinity. Some colonies were highly tolerant of their neighbors and others were very quick to wage war. So it seems that even with ants, some are more peaceful than others. Thank you. So.
Thank you, Catherine. That's fascinating.
Trying to get stop screen share. There, my back. Yeah.
It's fascinating to see them both on their sort of natural backdrop and on the white piece, and to see how you got that white image. I had been wondering that.
It was a technical issue about being able to film brown ants in brown leaf litter on dirt. But then once I came up with the idea to actually, because I've always tried to take the ants off of the ground to elevate them up because we so associate with insects and we can step on them when they're on the ground, to run them over logs or over rocks or things to get them off of the brown dirt. And in this case, I like the idea of white because it made it more of a universal war. It wasn't tied to a forest. It wasn't tied to something that insects would do that we wouldn't. It kind of made the battle a little bit more abstracted and universal.
Yeah, and the set designer in me sees it as a way to really focus on the character as opposed to the context.
And it helped lighting it too. And it helped because I have a handheld camera that I'm following the battles around. And that's really difficult to do in the dirt when you're kind of going like this. So this kind of created more of a level surface that allowed me to do a handheld camera to follow the war.
Thank you. That's awesome. Let's pass it on to James and see what you got to see.
Hi, everybody. I will share my screen, and we were asked to give 4-minute introductions, which is almost impossible for me, but I will try my best. Where do I have full screen? Oh, there. So I grew up in southwestern Connecticut in a town called Easton. I live 2 houses down from the house where I grew up. So I have a very, very strong sense of place. I was from an early age infatuated by things like birds and butterflies. My father introduced me to nature through his love of birds. He grew up in Brazil and fell in love with birds there. And when he moved to New Rochelle, New York at 12, he continued that love of birds. So I was drawing copies of works by John James Audubon and Roger Tory Peterson and people like that. And but I also had contact with these birds through books, but I also had direct sensual contact with these animals, like when this magnolia warbler hit the picture window of our home and died, and my father wasn't afraid to put it in my hands, and that feeling of holding an actual almost weightless little warbler had an enormous effect on me. So from that time, and I was drawing these little warblers, early drawing, somehow that went back. So from an early age, I loved birds and had the book experience through the field guides, where a picture of an animal corresponds with a name in a book. But then increasingly, I had these direct, as I said, more kind of sensual or visual contact with animals. At 9 years old, I fell in love with fishing, which gave me, and then fly fishing specifically for trout, which gave me an even more kind of intimate relationship with these animals through this kind of predatory pastime where you fashion an imitation of something in nature, like an insect using fur and feathers tied to a hook, and you cast it out to a fish. And Catherine mentioned not being able to communicate with her ants. I felt like I really was communicating with these fish through this medium of imitation in a secondary world of the fishing fly. That the imitation, the representation of nature enabled a communication with this animal, because if I thought it looked like an insect and the fish thought it looked like an insect, then our brains are actually connecting over in this secondary imitation world, which I have increasingly found to be more and more fascinating. The less I fish, the more I think about why I fished. So, you know, the fact that your minds, a human mind and a fish mind could connect, you know, minds that, you know, separated or last time when we split off from these fishes was probably 400 million years ago. So it's kind of remarkable. But at the same time that I was making imitations of nature to kind of catch the fish and actually physically connect with them and then touch them and hold them in my hands, which those experiences I cherished so much. I was also drawing the fish, which was another form of representation that I feel, after drawing hundreds, if not thousands of these fish as a kid, gave me a more intimate connection with the fish because when you draw something, as many of us know, you're forced to really observe it very closely. And as I was drawing the fish, I was reliving experiences of being with the fish. So it was almost like I was rehearsing these episodes with these animals, again, in this secondary world of the imagination. So I've now equated the drawing of the fish with the making of the imitation to catch the fish, and lump these all into this little theory of mine about representation and artifice or trickery, or that, like making a duck decoy to lure an animal closer to have a more intimate experience with it. And there's myriad examples of this, how humans have used imitations of nature to survive, and other animals use imitation to survive as well, through mimicry and things like that, which is a different process because it takes many more years to evolve, like a rear end of a caterpillar that looks like a venomous snake to keep away predators. But I think these things are actually part of the same process. So I started drawing trout, and at 10 years old, I couldn't find a book in the library of all the trout of North America. So I started thinking, well, maybe I'll make a book on the trout of North America. I started writing letters to departments of wildlife around the country and developed a correspondence with many biologists who were studying these different kinds of fish in the mountains of Nevada or Colorado or Connecticut, Maine. I wanted to create a list of all the different trout that lived in North America, all the species. But I learned very quickly, probably by the age of 12, that nobody could agree on how many species there was. And not only could they not agree how many species there was, they couldn't even agree on what the definition of a species was. And I learned that there's about 25 working definitions of what a species is. So I, at that point, began a sort of a lifelong inquiry about naming nature and what happens when you put words on a world that didn't have words on it. And so I'm really interested in stories like the Garden of Eden story with Adam and Eve. I think I'm already over 4 minutes, but I'll keep going. But I eventually published this book my freshman year in college of paintings of the trout of North America. And it did well enough that I continued to make paintings and write about things, as I had been doing since I was a kid. I then did a book on the trout of Europe and Asia and North Africa. Or this is a fish from Slovenia. This is a char from Hokkaido, Hokkaido, Japan. And it brought me to places I never would have gone before, like the headwaters of the Euphrates and the Tigris, to look for trout from the headwaters of the Tigris, which are very interesting because trout never colonized these rivers from the Persian Gulf because it was always too warm. So they colonized from the Caspian drainage and the Black Sea drainage and the Mediterranean drainage. Longer stories. These are little char from Hokkaido. This is a Mongolian rental car, but it sort of brought me around to meet different people who also loved fish and caught fish. Pretty much anywhere there's water, there's fish, and there's people trying to catch the fish. So we had people helping us catch, specimens that I was painting, and my friend Johannes was was studying. Anyway, it's a longer story, and I would talk more about Adam and Eve if I had more time, but I'll just briefly mention a few of the things I'm putting in the show at Mana Contemporary. I have a photograph of this installation I did at the Yale University Art Gallery recently, where I pinned 222 bird specimens to the wall in a color spectrum. And the point of this was that nature's this interconnected, constantly changing system. But in order to communicate it, we have to draw lines between things and label the pieces. And then we come to see the world as if it's made up of units that fit in boxes, and we forget the holistic, interconnected world that we tried to describe in the first place. And I draw this metaphor between colors in a spectrum and species on an evolutionary continuum, because something like a color red is really just it's something that we invent in order to discuss colors, but really there's no place where red ends and orange begins in a spectrum. We draw these lines artificially. So at Mana, I just completed these murals one is of Yellowstone National Park, next to this Dan Flavin exhibition, which I thought was kind of fun with the lights. So this is Yellowstone, and then there's a Florida Everglades scene, both habitats, of course, being affected by climate change, the white bark, the pine beetles killing white bark pines because the winters aren't cold enough to kill the larvae. And the Everglades, because of rising seawaters, will be affected. So the silhouettes and numbers are kind of the source material, these field guides, where you'd have silhouettes of animals with numbers, and the numbers match up to a list of names to help us learn to identify them by name. So I paint the silhouettes with the numbers, but there's no key of names, so people can't satisfy that urge to label them. So I think that's pretty much it. The last piece that I did for the show was this sort of reinterpretation of the American flag. I just was thinking about how linear and grid-like flags in general are, and they're more about boundaries and borders than about interconnectedness. Animals, of course, cross all the boundaries that we create as they move and migrate, and we do too. So these are each animal representing one of each of the 50 states. And I'm writing an article for National Geographic right now about how climate change is affecting the Gulf of Maine and warming waters, how that might cause a collapse in the lobster population. So I've been thinking a lot about climate change lately. That's all I have to say right now, but thank you very much. And I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. That is stunning, and I feel like there's a whole other panel we could have about the use of the white page and the white ground. But I also feel like you teed it up really beautifully to hand off to Ruth, was you were talking about this concept of really seeing and observing, and then potentially imitating and imitating the natural world, and that sort of cues us up, I think, for Ruth.
Okay, well, thank you. That was so beautiful, Catherine and James. And what you illustrated much more beautifully than I can do as a scientist is how both scientists and artists are opening new windows into the world and giving different perspectives than we see in our everyday lives. So in science, there's so many different kinds of perspectives that we can think about. One might be a very, microscopic perspective where we could see cells and magnify things in ways that you can't see otherwise. Another perspective is through time scales, where we can look into the past with fossils and ice cores, or try to predict the future with models. My perspective from a science realm is more macroscopic, and that is looking down on the Earth with satellites. And part of the reason to do that is because we can get some useful information about managing our resources and land. But another part of why to do that is because it's just beautiful. We can, from satellite, get out of ourselves and watch cities expand and watch forests getting cleared, which isn't so beautiful. Watch the effect of climate change on vegetation, which also is not so beautiful. Watch crops expanding and get the sense that we humans have such a dominant presence on the planet. But also, if you think about cities, which we tend to think is the whole world that we live in, and half of the world's population does live in cities, but it takes up such a small portion of the planet, like just a few percent of the land on the planet. And then you can start to think about cities as these kind of places that just suck their, support themselves through the food that is producing elsewhere and the water that's coming from elsewhere and sending the wastes elsewhere. And then we can think about all of those, the whole planet that is supporting the economic activity of our one single species, which is one among many, many millions of species. We don't even know how many species there are in the world. And as James said, we don't really even know what a species is, and it's very much a construct in our own minds. So this kind of macroscope, looking down at the world from a satellite perspective, just makes, to me, it makes me see how interconnected the world is, how people are so connected with the natural world, but how modern civilization is so connected as never before through trade and globalization and food moving around the world and pathogens, sadly, moving around the world in the matter of days. And to be able to, as both James and Catherine have said so beautifully and shown so beautifully in their work about how connected people are with each other and people are with the rest of the world and all the species and places throughout the world. So it's so this kind of perspective, macroscopic perspective in both a spatial sense and a time sense, just tells us, we as humans have been on this planet for such a sliver in time, such a small time scale compared to the existence of the billions of years of the planet. So Catherine, her beautiful images of the farming ants, the leafcutter ants that are farmers for the fungus, they've been doing that for millions of years. And humans have been farmers for maybe 12,000 years. So there is so much experience in nature that we can learn from, that has some lessons for us. And the connection between science and art in pulling out those lessons and learning from them and communicating from them is an exciting way to think about the world. So I'm so grateful for this conversation, because scientists and artists don't get to talk to each other enough. So this is so wonderful.
Thank you. That was beautiful to see those images as well. It looks like, it's stunning and sort of a shockingly different perspective or different point of view, which kind of brings me to the question I thought that I would launch us off with, which is I have this idea that certainly art, I think, where I come from, and it seems to me science too, are really rooted in really seeing the world around us. It's what we just saw. It's all about, before we can create or interpret or solve or act in any way, we have to perceive and see the world around us. And I feel like what the three of you have offered are different ways of seeing, and that an opening the possibility that those different ways of seeing might actually change the way we understand and perhaps then eventually act. I saw Catherine had close-ups, and we saw the difference between the white ground and the kind of night background, and how even just those two different ways of seeing changed, or at least for me, my understanding. James, we saw the isolated fish on the white ground and the use of silhouette, which is a way of changing how we see. And Ruth showed us a great distance. And also, Ruth, you didn't really mention this, but in your book, which I have here, I just read it and loved it, I feel like Ruth offers yet another sort of way of seeing these natural systems and creatures. And so I wanted to ask you guys, sorry, before I get so excited about seeing, how you guys, do you consciously manipulate the way you see, and how you use those changes in perspective or perception to shape your work and maybe shape the way your work might influence the world around you? I'll open it up to the full group.
Well, if I jump in here, I think for me, I don't see necessarily, I have a hunch, I have an interest, something that draws me to something. And it's through working with that species that the dialogue, the perception, the understanding comes. It's an exploration, it's a passage of discovery. And I think that I'm not a scientist. I know leafcutter ants. If you ask me about some other species, I would tell you, well, I don't know, go talk to a biologist. So I investigated leafcutter ants in response to being intrigued by them in order to be able to work with them. And so I feel that those perceptions come in the process of working as opposed to, let's say, beforehand.
E.M. Forster has an amazing quote. I used to use it in class all the time. It says, "How do I know what I mean until I see what I wrote?" And I feel like it relates to what you just said, where he doesn't have an idea beforehand. He writes and then he looks back and he said, "Oh, that's what I meant."
But that's kind of the exciting thing about being a creative person, is that process of discovery.
Ruth, do you want to go?
Well, I'll say, I mean, being a scientist, I mean, I look at the world by saying, what kind of perspective and analysis can we provide as scientists that might actually help help people make decisions and manage the world. So that's one aspect of the perspective. But the other perspective is that looking at the world from above just sort of makes us puts the reality that we are just tiny, both in space and in time, which makes us think about the idea that we're just temporary here on this planet, and we are living the legacy of what went before us, and we are leaving a legacy of what is into the future. So I think it's so easy to miss that kind of perspective when you're all wrapped up in your everyday life and trying to get through the day. But it's always I always just I could look at satellite imagery just forever, just to get out of myself.
Well, I appreciate that dose of humility from pulling out and seeing how insignificant we are. And I think about that a lot. And sometimes I wonder what it's all for, like all the work we put into our measly little lives. And but from a point of view of, observation and perception, and you mentioned, Sandra, both Catherine and I separate things from the environment and put them on white backgrounds. To me, that's really ironic in my own work, because I'm always trying to sort of preach interconnectedness, but you're right. I'm removing the trout from the river. I'm painting it on a white background. I'm taking the silhouette, even though there might be other elements from the environment. I'm reducing nature, because the human brain is as Aldous Huxley called it in the Doors of Perception, a cerebral reducing valve. We cannot absorb the enormity of nature. So we have to kind of I think the first step to creating knowledge is separation and reduction. In order to communicate things like trout and trees, we have to name them. And again, that involves chopping the interconnected continuum in pieces. And then, unfortunately, I don't think when you put the pieces back together, you get the whole again. You just get a bunch of pieces, and all the spaces in between that we lost through separation are never really recovered. But without language, we couldn't even communicate that concept. What's so beautiful about this tool is that we can communicate its inadequacies using it. So I've been writing a book for most of my life about how and why we name and order nature, and it's just difficult because I'm using language to sort of critique the failures of language. But language is also beautiful, of course. But I think that we can have both the separated world and the interconnected world in our heads, the named world, which is the separated world, and the unnamed world. Going back to the Adam and Eve story, one of my favorite naming stories is a one-page story published by Ursula Le Guin, named She Unnames Them, where Eve goes through the garden unnaming all the animals because she felt that once Adam had put labels on them, it created this us versus them situation. And before they had been named, she felt like there was a better sort of vibe in the Garden of Eden where everything was sort of part of the same interconnected whole. So, but if you look back earlier in Genesis, before Adam was even created, God created the planet. And I realize it's just, I'm not saying it was true, but as a story, it's really interesting. You know, God creates the world by separating light from darkness, air from water. Then he pulls a piece of clay and he makes Adam. And then he kind of, it's like, okay, Adam, go for it. Keep separating the world by labeling things. And then, you know, I think my main message that's been forming over the years, and then I'll stop, is that we need the reduction of nature. We need the separation, but we have to keep reminding ourselves that these maps that we create to navigate the world are not the actual world. They're just maps. And there's a famous quote, the map is not the territory. So that's been my main message. And walls are necessary, they're beautiful, and there are boundaries in nature, and other animals draw lines. You know, wolves mark territories with scent, birds do with song, but ours are somehow more indelible and more dangerous, I think. We make dams and fences and walls, and they're all ultimately ephemeral, but you know, they can do a lot of damage while they're there.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway.
How does that strike you, Ruth, as a scientist, where I always think of scientists as more in the world of, yes, classifying things and naming things? Do you see that tension as well in your work between the work of ordering and classifying and finding answers and also not?
Yes, so science is absolutely, well, at least Western science is absolutely about putting labels and categorizing and classifying, and because that's the way, as James said, the human mind works, or at least the way we've trained our human minds to work. But then ultimately, you get back, like there's been the whole, you know, species and phenology and naming and putting labels, but then there gets to a point in science where it breaks down, where there is, you know, then scientists will ask themselves, well, what did we mean by a species anyway? And then realize that that really it's a continuum, and that standard definition that species are defined by being able to you know, reproduce, that falls apart. So that tendency to classify is very much there, but there's also the tendency in science to keep, and in art, I suppose, to keep questioning and keep going back to the assumptions. And then when we do that, we uncover that this process of classification is so much a sort of a figment of our own imaginations.
I guess is sort of what you were proposing with that rainbow bird piece, James.
Yeah, and I'm by no means saying that classification or labeling or naming is bad. It's actually, as Ruth said, it's a necessary first step in communication and understanding. And I did start, you know, early on in my sort of inquiry about names and stuff, I was like, Linnaeus, what a bastard, you know, what hubris. He thought he could sort of order the whole world. And then I'm like, without Linnaeus, we wouldn't have had Darwin. I mean, Linnaeus's sort of hierarchy of nested categories from kingdom, class, order down to genus and species. I think Darwin would never have seen the tree of life without that tree that Linnaeus created. So it's sometimes even you have to go in a path that may be sort of right to get to more right. And then you go back and say, what a contribution this guy made. As much of a DICK as he was said to have been, and so arrogant, and, you know, he made a big contribution. But then, you know, I think scientists and artists, as Ruth said, we have to constantly keep revising and testing the boundaries that we set up, and then erasing the boundaries and creating new boundaries. And then the new generation erases those boundaries and makes new boundaries. I don't see where it ends. I don't see how humans can perhaps evolve to a form of communication that doesn't involve separation. I don't know if there's a way that we can communicate a spectrum without separating. That would be a cool thing one day. Maybe the internet is this large, digital brain made up of, communication through binaries, which is oddly enough ones and zeros, which are more kind of, it's just so simple and beautiful, but it builds this complexity that I don't know where I'm just blabbing now, but I wonder if there is a form of communication that doesn't involve separation. And I think science is going that direction. And there's mathematics, there's, the more we pull out, the more we look at the big aerial views, the more we realize how pale and insignificant are the borders between nations in your maps, Ruth, kind of evaporate. And as you said, something like the COVID-19 just blasted across the planet, like in a matter of days. Climate change doesn't care about boundaries and borders. So we're constantly being reminded by nature that all this stuff is artificial, but yet it is, but it isn't. I mean, a tree is different than a cow, right? So there clearly are, discrete biological units, but they're not that discrete. They're actually, I think, more interconnected than separate. But again, I think for me, it's a tension between separation and interconnectedness that propels us forward. That it's like, it's a friction that is an integral part of our survival, of our communication, of our thinking. But we have to acknowledge which parts are fabricated. And we love lines so much that we live by lines, we die by lines, we defend those lines once they're there. And it causes all kinds of problems, like all these social justice issues. I mean, artificial boundaries between each other and in so many different ways that really, if we could one day acknowledge that they're not really there, maybe things would be better. But unfortunately, there's been so much bad stuff with lines that we have to kind of acknowledge that before we can move forward. But
yeah, I mean,
it's complicated. It makes me think, Catherine, of something you said earlier about the ants and how they communicate. And I was wondering if you could sort of take us a little bit back into the ant world as we're thinking about this concept of like the individual, the network, the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, just for one comment first on James, is that it's not only lines, it's how we perceive what's on the other side. And I think that science can reveal things. Like this whole discussion about what a species is and what it's not. Science can't even define what's alive. Is a virus alive? Is it dead? And so the perceptions of things have so changed. You think of the wolf. The wolf was something that was the devil, was vilified, and then we spend millions of dollars reintroducing him to landscapes where they had a bounty on their head. So that perception of that animal has changed, and the animal is being slaughtered or it's actually being restored. And so even though you can speak about lines, it's how do we perceive what's not us? How do we perceive what's on the other side of this human world? And I think that gets kind of to the crux of where we are in terms of the society, of how do we perceive what's not us? How do we care? How do we don't care? How do we deal with it? And that has changed enormously over human evolution. And I think, working with ants, it's kind of one of these interesting things is that the lack of central command is a hard thing for a species like us to get our mind around, because we're at this interesting border where we're social, but we're individual. And we have this duality between the two that butts up. Sometimes we are celebrated for acting as a selfless individual. And sometimes we're called upon to be the hero and lead the day and lead the charge, whatever it's going to be. So we have to be able to identify which role we should be in under which social situations. And the ants don't have that duality. They are collecting data. They are constantly communicating data to the ants around them, also, and from single to multiples in terms of the pheromone trails, where they're adding into this pheromone trail as every ant that is going on it. And so you have this emergent type of system, which becomes highly adaptable because there's no single point of failure. There's no central command that's making a bad decision. And so they are infinitely able to adapt quickly. For instance, I'm trying to get them to change their mind to, let's say, to go up on top of a log, because it's a more beautiful place to film them. They'll resent something, but I have to entice them to do that. Or I would like them to take flowers or the letters from the leaves which they are cutting, but I'm trying to get them to change their mind. So I'm interacting with this emergent dialogue, this network communication, where you're dealing with a colony as opposed to an individual. And then that starts making me think about what is social media and how we interact and how our communications are becoming more efficient like theirs. The difference that I've seen is that ants don't lie. Where we can use these social networking to actually falsify and put information out that is not true, that we know is not true for particular gains. And ants don't do that.
Mm. Does an individual ant make a decision, or is that just not a language you can use for an ant?
Yes, it's constantly having inputs that are coming in. So, and it will change its behavior according to those inputs. And so, yes, so like for instance, if an ant is going out and is going to forage for X, if it passes 10 ants, let's say, that are carrying something that's not what it's intending to go out to collect, if those 10 ants pass it over a short period of time, so it becomes a rate issue, then it will change its mind. But if it's over a much larger period of time, those same ants that it passed, it won't change its mind. And so you can test that, and you can see that if one person, says fire and nobody responds, does the rest of the room respond? If somebody says it the next day and the next day and the next day, probably nobody respond. If 10 people in a very short period of time give the same message, then all the other ants in that vicinity will change.
It's so interesting what Catherine is saying about the ants, because in nature, you don't really find examples of central command, top-down command, like a ruler from the capital city commanding what everybody else should do. You don't see that in nature. So that should suggest to us that there is some perhaps value in that approach of bottom-up decisions if we think that our modern civilization is a complex system like an ant colony or like a food web. And I would argue that it is a complex system which is constantly adapting to itself. So this idea of a queen ant is again a kind of human construct, that the queen has command and can tell all the ants where to go. As Catherine said, that's not really what they're doing. They're reacting instinctively through the pheromones to their local surroundings. And we tend to think about regulations, and we think about the very famous tragedy of the commons, which means you have to tell people what to do and forbid people to do that, and the other thing. And there's the wonderful work of the political scientist Eleanor Ostrom, which took a different tack and looked at so many examples where people self-organized more like nature than top-down control, and effectively managed themselves better than top-down kind of command and control. So there's really something that we can learn there from nature for our own civilization.
I think at this point in society where we are now, however many billions of people on the planet that are living predominantly in urban environments, then those interactions of a more emergent type of communication is possible. But at a time when people live huge distances apart in small groups, then that type of communication or that type of organization was not necessarily so effective. But we are changing how we live, becoming for the first time in human existence, being a predominantly urban species.
Hmm. That's interesting. You're almost like you're saying this new model of bottom-up self-governance might be available to us now, possibly for the first time at scale in our species history.
And technology allows that too, with just, texting and all the different ways we have of instant messaging each other.
I think, yeah, bringing in the political science element is kind of interesting. I remember reading in a book by Jim Scott, Seeing Like a State, where they tried to create, Brasilia, this new capital from scratch in the middle of nowhere. And they designed it, where the people would live separate from where they worked because they thought that would be a cool way to live. And then what ended up happening is that the whole place just didn't happen the way they expected, and it became like an ant colony where it's just like people wanted to work closer to where they lived, or villages just cropped up in the middle of where they would organically. So the attempt by the powers that be to force people to live a certain way just ultimately didn't work. And I'm forgetting, maybe Ruth remembers if she read it, but it's just fascinating. You can't really force things into boxes. Ultimately, nature will just sort of create its own messiness that works for nature, and humans included, but which is kind of refreshing, I think.
Gosh, I have so many questions about this. Like, I'll allow myself one, and then but as humans, if we organized ourselves like ants, would the systems and patterns that emerge help us out of the mess we're in necessarily, or would we potentially bottom up some equally destructive solutions?
Well, I think one of the things that's interesting that at the beginning, when the rise of social media and the rise of the ability to have these mobile devices that communicate wherever we are directly to somebody else and at an instant, we had these great hopes that it would be a little bit more of user generated data and everybody's sort of sharing and becoming a little bit more of a bottom up culture. But I think the thing that what we found is that those same channels can be used for false information. And so the idea of Facebook, of connecting people, seemed like a great experiment and seemed like a good thing until you understand that those vehicles are also ways for misinformation to come out and colonize people in the same sense as a top-down type of a system, where people then start believing, for example, that Trump won the election or that climate change doesn't exist. And so I think the thing that becomes tricky with humans is that they, unlike many species, lie.
But Catherine, social insects have the same problem, that in relation to disease and the spread of pathogens. And if there is a pathogen which gets into the colony, they're so connected, like you've shown, a pathogen could spread throughout, just like COVID has spread throughout the world. But it doesn't happen that often. But you know why it doesn't happen? It's because their network strategy is in a modular kind of way. So the worker ants are communicating with each other, and the disposer ants are communicating with each other, and it's modular. So when a pathogen gets into their colony, they can just cut off a whole part of their communication because it's in modules. And that is like akin to our keeping pods with family and friends or stopping travel between the countries. But they do it, social insects do it much better than we do. And that's a way that has been a strategy that has evolved over very long times to keep the spread of disease. But you could also apply that to our human, misinformation, spread of misinformation, to find those points where you could those key places where the communication is happening, and then cut it off there.
Yeah, I mean, leafcutter ants, I mean, they have pathogens that they're constantly battling, and that's where their mastery of chemistry comes in, is to be able to keep the bacteria at bay that are trying to eat their fungus as opposed to them. So there's a constantly waging battle within the colony of bacteria that wants to eat their fungus, or fungus that wants to eat their fungus, and they enlist other bacteria to kill the bad bacteria, which is going to kill the fungus. I mean, it's just so that, you know, they then become these master chemists down inside the colony to keep their fungus gardens healthy. And if something actually does happen, you'll find a whole colony will move. And then once you take the ants out of a colony, once they leave, the fungus gardens collapse within 24 hours. That's how effective they are at keeping all those pathogens at bay that want to take over their fungus gardens. You remove the ants and everything collapses within 24 hours.
Well, they also have some strategies that we really wouldn't want to emulate in.
Yes, that's true.
In humans, like the infected leaving the nest and self-sacrificing and dragging infected individuals out and things like that. Not something we would want to do, but some of the strategies are really, really applicable to our modern world.
Well, it is close to the hour. I wanted to ask one short question before we look to questions from the audience. I'm wondering for each of you, and you guys can punt if you feel like this is a lame question, but I want to ask, do you hope that your work will spark people to action? Is it are you wanting them to connect in a way with these creatures and with the things that you're seeing? Are you hoping to spark them to emotion? Or do you not worry about that and you're just doing your thing and it doesn't matter what the effect is? And this is for all three, science and art.
Well, if we're going in the same order, I mean, I connect with the ants by working with them, and I hope that connection through the work is communicated and that people will be drawn to something that I've connected to, and then have that as a way for them to connect to it. Because I think that there are so few avenues for the average person to have a meaningful relationship with the natural world where they're going beyond being a tourist in the landscape. And so as an artist investigating that, similarly to a science who's bringing out data, I go in and I investigate and I explore and bring out what I have uncovered and discovered and created, and hope that then offers some avenue for people to connect to something that they would maybe have no experience with.
Ruth?
Yeah, okay. So I've learned that it really is not a very effective strategy to try to tell people what they should do. That's just kind of a pathway to people doing the opposite. Sort of something that you learn as a parent, right? But the way I see more the impact is just how appreciating the planet that we're on, the amazingness of this planet and the amazingness of nature, and however people appreciate that and take it into their lives in many different ways, whether they think they take that into politics or into their daily life or into their careers, or however is appropriate for them to build on just this appreciation of our incredible planet.
Yeah, I see in Catherine and Ruth's work, of course, a production of awe and reverence for the natural world, which I think is an important place to start. My work came out of a childhood love of these animals like trout that was just so pure. I can't even recover what that was. I have no idea. Maybe it's just purely like biophilia. It's just why we love these things. I have no idea, but my love of them led me to draw them. And my hope, at least for the first project of painting all the trout in North America, was that it's hard to access this beauty because these things live in little streams on the top of mountains, and you have to catch them and pull them out of the water to see their colors. You have to actually take them out of their element, the water, and bring them into the air and let the sun beam down on them, and then painting them with watercolors you know, I think and hope that a work like that expose people to the beauty and diversity of nature that they might not have seen before. Maybe even compel them to go up to the Kern Plateau at the base of Mount Whitney in the Sierras and try to catch one and look at it. And then maybe if they do, they'll be moved to protect it. Doesn't necessarily have to involve catching it, but really, I think for anglers, that direct contact with these animals is important, and you can't really see them unless you pull them out of the water, unfortunately. But yeah, and I maybe it's well, anyway, I guess I do hope that some of the messages that I continuously, spin out from my barn, like about acknowledging that the map is not the terrain, that the way we communicate nature is not necessarily nature. It might get close, but that it's important to try to communicate these things in different ways. My method of communication has tried not to preach or to, as Ruth says, pound people with telling them what to do, but more just demonstrate through a visual medium, again, the beauty and diversity of the planet, and hope that allows people to forge their own connections with these fish or creatures. Because when I was a kid, the field guide, as much as it might be a reduced version of nature based on labels and pictures of individuals that don't really represent a species fully, like Roger Torrey Peterson's field guides were a huge part of and these little golden field guides my dad had. I don't think without those books, I wouldn't have seen nature or been able to connect with it as well. So as even I might criticize what they are, they were really, I don't think I would have connected with nature without them. So anyway, I like books.
Well, thank you. That's a beautiful way to end from each of you. I think we'll look for questions from the chat, but the idea that it's certainly true in my case that seeing and reading, experiencing all three of your work has helped me see, connect, and feel it's about love and reverence. It's an amazing place to end. So thank you all for your work and for this conversation. Eden, is there anything in the chat we should look at, or is that a good sort of spot?
So we received a question in the chat that was to Catherine specifically about how did you decide to work with ants, and more specifically leaf ants. But I would love to broaden the question for James and Ruth as well, to kind of ask, your subject, or like, what you're studying or creating. How do you narrow in? What do you decide to work with or investigate?
Yeah, with the ants, it was interesting because and I think you never really know when a project starts where it's going to go. I first saw leafcutter ants in 1999, trekking through the rainforest in Costa Rica, and I couldn't believe that there were these little creatures carrying bits of the high forest canopy, a little bit of green, because the rainforest floor is often very brown. And so you see these lions, like a parade of these ants carrying these little flickering bits of the high canopy. And you think, really, that exists? I mean, look at them. It was just magnificently beautiful. And at that point, I was working on a cockroach project. And they were so overwhelming in nature, I didn't really know how to work with them. So I just kept throwing ideas into a bin. And then it wasn't until 2007 where I got an opportunity to actually go down to Central America and work with them. I got invited by a collector to do a piece down there. And it was in working with them that I discovered their communication, which became the heart of the project. But at first I just thought they were beautiful. So I was lucky that they kept going, and it kept going and they opened up, but you never know. You just think, well, maybe there'll be one thing I can do with them. I'm going to try this out. And then I moved to Costa Rica to work. And that's when the whole project opened up, because there were more colonies of leafcutter ants in this area than I had ever seen anywhere. And that allowed me to see a dialogue between the different colonies and see the different behavioral patterns. So it was a little bit of luck on top of luck on top of luck that allowed this project to unfold, where simply I started because they were beautiful.
Ruth, you want to go next?
Well, just very briefly, because I know we're already over time, but I don't know. I just, I think that many people of my generation are like this. National Geographic had such an enormous influence in just the pictures and the people and nature. And I couldn't decide whether I wanted to study anthropology or geology. And maybe I found a way to combine those, but just as you said, just reverence and awe about how people connect with nature and how much diversity there is out in the world of people and thought and species and plants and animals. Just I really think National Geographic had a big part, again, getting back to James' point, that that books and what we get exposed to just has such a big influence on us.
Yeah, similarly to everybody else, awe, beauty, wonder, mystery, reverence, those things that bubble up in me have pushed me or compelled me to dig deeper into particular subjects. Or like I spent 12 years working on a book about freshwater eels, which aren't the most conventionally beautiful animals. And some people who knew about my trout work were like, why are you going from like working on the most beautiful fish to the ugliest fish? But to me, they were beautiful. Their movements, their sinuous movements through the water. But really what initially led me to be interested in them was that, they live their adult lives in freshwater streams or lakes and ponds, like the pond across the street from my house in Connecticut. But they're born in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean in this huge gyre called the Sargasso Sea, and humans have never witnessed them reproducing. And that idea that there are many creatures out there whose life histories and reproductive histories happen outside of what we can see. Rachel Carson wrote, outside of human thought and maybe human knowledge or something in Under the Sea Wind about eels. She personified this female eel who was making a journey out to the middle of the Sargasso. But once they disappear, once they leave the rivers, we never see them again. We've tried to tag them, track them, do everything, but the only reason we know they spawn in the middle of the ocean is because they've netted little babies out there, little larvae. And the larvae don't look anything like eels. So originally they were classified as a separate species of fish, Leptocephalus brevirostris. And it wasn't until this Danish oceanographer figured it out that these were baby eels. They didn't know that they spawned in the middle of the ocean. So just these things that happen on our planet, which are just like beyond human comprehension, just personally lead me to want to know, but also to preserve unknowingness through storytelling. The big question is, do we want to know where they go? Do we want to be able to film them? And that was a question I encountered with freshwater eels in New Zealand, where they're very important to the Maori people spiritually, and they don't want to know where they go. They know they go out to the ocean to spawn there, but so that these tensions between named and unnamed, knowing and unknowing, are kind of I think touch points for me, or have been.
That's a beautiful
I just
spot.
want to add one point in here. How fortunate all of us are to be able to pursue what fascinates us.
Well, that is a beautiful spot to end. I think we should wrap it up, but I want to sort of just name that invitation to all of us to recognize our good fortune in being surrounded by this unbelievably beautiful earth, and to encourage us all to stop and see it and know it in whatever way we know the world, and appreciate it. Thank you all. That's a really beautiful message for us all. I appreciate you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Hope to get you to see you all in person one day.
Yes.
Thursday for the show. Yeah, everybody come to the exhibition at Mana.
Everyone, please RSVP and come to visit the exhibition at Mana Contemporary in Clydesdale. Thank you, James, Catherine, and Ruth, and Sandra for participating and moderating this really engaging talk. And thank you all for attending. We hope to see you soon. Thanks so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much.